Welcome back to Forward Progress, part of the Hammer Betting Network. I'm your host, Jason Cooper, alongside Ben Standig, senior NFL writer covering the Washington Commanders for The Athletic and the host of the Standig Room Only podcast. You can find Ben on X at Ben Standig. Today we'll be covering everything you need to know about the Washington Commanders heading into 2024. Before we get started, I want you to quickly comment below how many wins you think the Commanders are going to get in 2024. Let's jump right into it. Ben, before we start looking forward, we must look back. Commanders finished the 2023 season with a 4-13 record. I mean, left a lot to be desired there in that 2023 season. So before we talk about 2024, let's talk a bit about 2023. Give me one word or phrase to describe the Commanders last season.
Yeah, last season. Boy, I was gonna say protracted. I don't know if that explains though just how it was such a slog down the stretch when when we knew it was more likely than not that they were going to make significant changes with the coaching staff, and when it go from 4-5 to 4-13, a lot of losses, and it just took forever to get to the finish line. The last 6 weeks was tough. So yeah, protracted, I guess.
Protracted, and you mentioned it right there. We knew the change was coming. We knew there was going to be a lot of turnover, especially when you finish, like you make the effort to kind of finish in that lower seat to get that higher pick. So yeah, a lot of turnover here. And we're going to talk about that all right now. Commanders, obviously the biggest thing that they turned over was their coaching staff. Ton of change throughout the offseason. The most notable one for me has to be bringing in the head coach, Dan Quinn, kind of the second time he's being a head coach in the NFL. Kind of becomes a de facto defensive play caller as well. So tell me a little bit about Dan Quinn, how he's fit so far as the head coach of this team, and do you think he'll be able to kind of elevate the current talent they have on defense as a play caller?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, as a coach, he took Atlanta to a Super Bowl in his second season. I know things went downhill a bit from there, and that's why he ultimately ended up getting fired before he went to the Cowboys as a defensive coordinator. But, he's been a defensive coordinator with the Seahawks when they were a dominant defense and won a Super Bowl. I know Dallas fell short of expectations, but they had one of the better defenses in the league the last few years under Quinn. So I think from that perspective, that they should be a lot better on defense. I don't know if a lot better means top 15, but like the lows last year were pretty low, so I think that's going to help. I think the biggest thing for Dan Quinn right now is I know the culture term gets used a lot and probably a bit much, but I don't think it's overstating how much of a culture change was required here, considering everything that's gone on previously with the new ownership, and not just that, just they haven't won a playoff game since 2005. They haven't won more than 10 games since the last time they went to the Super Bowl back in 1991. Like they need to completely reset everything, and I think Dan Quinn is probably one of the better options for that. He's very positive. He's a people person. He's good at, I think, bringing a group together. And when half the roster is different, a completely new coaching staff, a new front office, I think you need to have somebody who's like a connector there. How it works on the field ultimately, there's a lot of variables there. But I think in terms of what they need right now to become energized, to become a group and have a good mindset, I think he is a pretty good option as a head coach.
All right, you mentioned the on-the-field stuff, and let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, the Commanders went through, like I said before, plenty of changes this offseason. A lot of it came through the defense here, investing a lot of money towards the defense. They kind of changed a lot of pieces in their defensive front, bringing in edge rushers Dante Fowler and Ferrell, and adding veteran linebackers like Bobby Wagner and Frankie Luvu. They also added safety Jeremy Chinn. You talked a little bit about it previously, how their defense wasn't very good last year, 32nd in EPA per pass, around mid-20s in EPA per rush against, like really struggled on defense. Commanders spent a ton of money bringing in these veterans, but one area I feel like they failed to address was that cornerback grouping, that secondary. I know they brought in Jeremy Chinn, but I feel like they could have done maybe a little bit more. So tell me a little bit about what you make of the money allocation towards the defense. Do you feel like it went to the right place? Do you feel like they made the sufficient moves to address the weakness that was their defense? And what are your expectations for this defense in 2024?
Yeah, well, I think first off, like I would, for the bigger viewpoint, look, obviously they want to win this year. Like, no, this isn't the NFL. You can't tank the way we see some teams in do in other sports for picks, in part because it's just too physical, right? So that said, they are, in my view, they are not trying to win big this year. They are trying to reset everything, as I said, start a foundation of what it means to be a player on this team. And then with the draft, obviously they got some interesting players we'll talk about. They're starting to get their building blocks. But with the veterans, I think a lot of it was just simply to help them have that better culture, for lack of a better term. So I don't really think that they said, hey, we have these issues, we need to address them. I think they handed out, they signed over 20 free agents, but only a small handful got multi-year deals. Luvu was one of them. I think he's a guy that they're very excited about, to give them that, not a Micah Parsons player from a talent perspective, but from a versatility perspective, where they had Parsons lining up all over the place at the line, at linebacker, and Luvu is going to be that guy too. Bobby Wagner, he's here on a 1-year deal. He's somewhere on the back 9 of his career. I don't know if it's just he just made the turn, or he's in the last few holes of his Hall of Fame career. But like, he's a leader. He's done it all, and he's going to be a commanding presence for them. And again, I think they needed that type of guy. So in terms of the secondary, yeah, they didn't add. If they were a team that was really kind of going for it, I agree with you. They needed to add another stronger piece. As it is, they've got some younger guys. They got Benjamin St-Juste in his going into his fourth year. He's had some moments where you're kind of interesting, but like the rest of the secondary, he just took a step back last year. Emmanuel Forbes, their first round pick a year ago, it was a rough rookie year, with no question. But he's also a guy that had a lot of playmaking ability in college, and he set the NCAA record for most interceptions returned for touchdown, and now he's joining a coaching staff who the last 2 years in Dallas had the league leader in interceptions, including a guy like Deron Bland, who was a 5th-round pick and then became, a really strong player. So I'm excited to see what the coaching staff can do there. They brought in Mike Davis as like a general veteran, and they drafted Mike Sanderstill out of Michigan in the 2nd round to be their slot guy. Is that going, or opposing quarterbacks can be afraid of that? I don't think so. But again, I don't think they want to see what they have going into next year, and then I think that's where they make a lot of moves. They still have like $50 million in cap space, which will transfer over. So they did what they needed to do to reset this, but they didn't. I think purposely did not make bolder moves at certain positions of need, because they're more focused on the long term, not just this year.
Yeah, and you mentioned it, like Mike Sanderstill, who's coming in to play that slot corner role, as well as Jerzan Newton, defensive tackle. They look to address these areas of needs in kind of the draft, and it's a good process to kind of see where these guys are at going into next year. Let's flip over to the offensive side of the ball and talk a little bit more about offseason additions. Right, Kliff Kingsbury was brought in to be the offensive coordinator of the Commanders, and then also, of course, as everyone knows, Commanders with the 2nd overall pick drafted Jayden Daniels. So tell me a little bit about Kliff Kingsbury, how he likes to run his offense, and how these two, Kingsbury and Daniels, have kind of been meshing this offseason. What have you been hearing on that front?
Yeah, so as a reporter, and then, even if you were a fan, one of the frustrating aspects right now is we don't really know a lot. And I say that because it's all they're a complete mystery. I mean, whatever disadvantages they may have on the field this year in terms of either talent or strengths and weaknesses, their big advantage to start the year is the unknown. That people don't exactly know what is going to happen. Now we can look at it. So, for example, with Kingsbury, we can look at his past and say, okay, he ran a lot of 3 and 4 receiver sets with the Cardinals. He's an up-tempo offense kind of a guy. He had a mobile quarterback in Arizona with Kyler Murray, right? Not to mention Patrick Mahomes at Texas Tech. So having Jayden Daniels seems like a perfect fit. To have a guy who's a dual threat at that position, it wouldn't be as obvious to have a sort of more pocket passer with Kingsbury. Not that there's a ton of those anymore anyway, but you know what I mean. So I think the fit seems pretty good. But again, we'll have to see. They've got questions on the offensive line. Is Kingsbury's system going to help that group? They're going to get the ball out of Daniels' hand quickly to help avoid sacks and hits and, again, protect everybody. I think that's something that's certainly plausible. But they're going to use a lot of different formations. Going to try to get the ball into their playmakers. I know these are things that everybody kind of says. But, again, this is kind of what we're left with right now, because it's hard to know exactly what they're going to do, because Kingsbury is saying the right things about not bringing the Arizona offense with him here. He wants to have the Washington offense here, but until we see that happen, it's kind of hard to know how much changes he will make from his previous versions, as well as how much is he really going to, let the players here dictate, as opposed to him saying, "Hey, I want to do this regardless."
Yeah, and that's a great point. I guess we'll find out more as we get some more information heading into training camp, and we start to see some preseason games played, kind of the type of offense that they'll be running here, and how the two of Kingsbury and Jayden Daniels are going to mesh together. One question I have, though, is about the offensive line. You kind of brought it up and touched on it a little bit, so I want to kind of go into that there. Last year, Sam Howell kind of got crushed behind this offensive line. Some of it was on his ability just to not get rid of the ball quickly enough. Some of it was on Eric Bieniemy just not scheming up enough blocking for him. And then some of it was on the talent of the O-line itself. The Commanders kind of addressed their O-line. They brought in Tyler Biadasz and guard Nick Allegretti. They drafted Brandon Coleman in the 3rd round. I assume he's going to be a swing tackle. Doubt he starts or is even close to starting heading into this year. So one of the biggest knocks on Jayden Daniels coming into this draft was his struggles with sack avoidance. And there's been a lot of data showing that the inability to avoid sacks is like a translatable stat into the NFL. So do you feel like this offensive line has been elevated enough by the pieces that they brought in to help Jayden Daniels in pass protection? Are you worried about his sack avoidance at all this year?
Yeah, no, you make a great point about that stat, something that carries over. Sam Howell, that was one of his knocks at North Carolina, and then we watched him here, and yeah, the offensive line wasn't great, but he was holding on to the ball a fair amount of time in the pocket, and that really led to a lot of the, I don't know what percentage of the sacks to assign to him versus the line, but yes, it was a factor there. Look, I think that is a concern with Daniels, but again, we'll see. Everything is relative to like what is the system that you're running, and what are your expectations? What are they telling you to do? Here again, I would think that they're going to tell him to get rid of the ball, not panicky, but just as a general flow of the offense, right? So if they can do that, I think that's going to help. In terms of the line, the big questions are on the left side. You mentioned Nick Allegretti. Look, he was pretty heroic playing for the Chiefs late in the playoffs in the Super Bowl, playing most of the Super Bowl with a busted arm. But he also was the backup there. So it's not like he's like some proven, 5-year starter at the position. But okay, they think that's interesting there. Tyler Biadasz is an upgrade at center. The left tackle spot is where you have questions. Now, Cornelius Lucas is probably the projected starter right now. He is he's like a 32-year-old guy who's been basically a backup swing tackle his whole career. He's been with Washington since 2020. He's played several games each season because of injuries, and he's been okay. Like, it's not like he comes in and you're like, oh boy, here's a turnstile. On the other hand, there's a reason why he's been a backup, and I think over time, with more exposure, is where the problems start coming into play. So I think, this is my guess, I think if they can have him at least get there through the first month or so, and then see where Brandon Coleman is at, if he can do it, then that might be the plan. This is also a spot where fans are certainly hoping they add a veteran in free agency. There's just not a lot out there. And again, I just don't see Washington, like, if you're a veteran who has options, I don't know why you would go to the team that's probably unlikely to be a real playoff contender. But again, beggars can't be choosers. So we'll see what they do. So they could add some more pieces, but otherwise that left tackle spot is the question. They'll learn a lot more in training camp than they did in OTAs, but that one is particular. So I don't know if they've upgraded their line so much, but hopefully Daniels, between his running ability as well as, just being a little more mature, it can avoid some of the problems that maybe happened last year.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm going to be following throughout the season and paying attention to in the first couple of games, is how Daniels kind of meshes behind that offensive line. If he's still struggling with sack avoidance, something to kind of follow in the early days of the NFL season as we get through the first couple of weeks. Before we get into expectations, quickly want to ask you questions for some fantasy heads out there. A couple interesting moves and a couple interesting players where you kind of have a question about their playing time and their usage. First and foremost, I want to mention Austin Eckler, who they brought in through free agency. His role versus Brian Robinson, what you could see there. And then also Zach Ertz, another guy they brought in, but they also drafted Ben Sinnott in the 3rd round. another tight end. What's the playing time going to look like there? And then finally, Luke McCaffrey, who you have to assume is going to be playing their slot corner. So if you could tell me a little bit about those three situations, where you could see the usage of these players, and if you think there's any fantasy implications there.
Sure. Well, I think with the tight end spot, just to start there, look, I think Zach Ertz showed me a little bit more physically or athletically with his some speed in OTAs than I was expecting. That said, I don't see him being a guy you're going to look to draft. I mean, he just, look, he's far removed from his Pro Bowl days. He's familiar with Kliff Kingsbury from their Arizona time, and when he's been healthy, he's still been somewhat productive. But I don't know how much is going to be there. Plus, Ben Standig is a really interesting rookie that can play kind of all over the formation. Certainly he's if you're like in a dynasty kind of league, he might be kind of an interesting one to latch onto. But again, I find it hard to believe that any tight end in Washington is going to be much of a fantasy threat. Luke McCaffrey would probably be my front runner to be the third receiver. They've used him outside as well. He's the tallest receiver they have, and they moved Jahan Dotson in a bit more during some of the OTAs. Again, I think McCaffrey was being viewed as the slot guy when he came in, so they're just trying people in different spots. We'll see. But from a fantasy perspective, between Terry McLaurin and Dotson, you would think they would dominate targets. And then you mentioned Austin Eckler; he's going to be a pass catching threat. So I don't think I'm going to trust Luke McCaffrey too much from a fantasy perspective. The Eckler part is obviously the most interesting. This is a guy that just 2 years ago led the league in touchdowns for the second straight year. So, he's obviously been very productive. Last year was a bit scary though because of he gets a high ankle sprain in week 1, never really recovers. He averages a career low 3.5 yards per carry. I wish I could tell you that having watched him, he's back, he's good. I'm not saying he's not. I'm just saying we haven't seen enough to really know that. Again, no pads and all that kind of fun stuff. So my sense would be that Brian Robinson is going to be the guy that gets 12 to 20 touches in a game. He'll be the lead back. Look, I don't know how often they're going to have a lead in the second half, but if they do, then that's when he'll get up to the higher end of those numbers. And Kliff Kingsbury's history at Arizona shows that the lead bigger running back gets touchdowns. But James Conner and Kenyon Drake both had seasons with 10 or more touchdowns a year as the lead back. So I think Robinson, I would look for that some good stuff there. And he's a decent pass catcher. I think he's underrated. Eckler, I'd probably put in the 8 to 12 range, but in terms of touches, but who knows? It could be a little bit lower if they're a little bit concerned about wear and tear. Maybe it's higher if he's showing an ability to be really to be back to where he was a couple years ago, or at least closer to it. And he would be a great safety valve in the passing game for the rookie quarterback. So I think Robinson's the lead, but Eckler is the big wild card for sure.
Interesting. All right, let's flip over and talk some expectations. Just looking at the odds over on FanDuel right now, the Washington Commanders are around 11 to 1 to win their division, to win the conference 50 to 1, Super Bowl 120 to 1, and their win total is around 6.5. It's year one of Jayden Daniels. Obviously, not expectations aren't sky high for a team that are just coming off a 4-win season. But Jayden Daniels is that mobile dual threat quarterback, and that's the type of quarterback who generally outperforms expectations for a rookie quarterback, right? So with that in mind, what are your expectations for the Commanders in 2024?
Everybody around here has got very high expectations. I'm not saying they're talking Super Bowl or even necessarily the playoffs, but I think most people around here would say they would take that over. That, look, this team won 4 games last year. They were 4-5, lost the last 8. And if the coaching staff gets more out of these players and Jayden Daniels comes in and, from like a fantasy perspective, but also a real play perspective, that ability to run. He's a passer first or runner second, but his ability to run raises his floor, right? That said, go back. Justin Herbert had a tremendous rookie year and the Chargers were 500. I know C.J. Stroud was a guy that everybody points to from last year. That's more of an anomaly than like, hey, that's you can easily replicate that. So, and plus, like, Houston was already like in like year 3 or 4 of their rebuild, right? Nico Collins was already on the team, Jonathan Grenard on defense, etc. The Commanders, they're starting over now. So they have he has some pieces again. Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson's coming off a disappointing year, but there's he's obviously a talented player. So it's not he could be pretty good, but I just think there's still too many holes. So I'm going under, but talk to me again. Let me see what they look like in training camp, which is always not a great barometer either. But that at least give me a better feel for what they have. I think they still have they don't have their pass rush is going to be sketchy. We mentioned the offensive line. Other than McLaurin and Dotson, I don't know what other receiver we could say they can really rely on. And then just a rookie's going to be a rookie. So I just think all those things make me want to go under. If you want to tell me they get to 7 wins, sure. But I don't see it being robust over that as it stands today.
Yeah, it's almost like the distribution for you is maybe they get up to 7, but it's more likely to get to 6 or 5 kind of. Anyways, that does it for us here today. Let us know your thoughts on the 2024 Commanders in the comment section down below. Make sure you follow Ben Standig on X at Ben Standig. If you made it this far, guess what? That means you like this content. So please press that like button. It goes a long way for us here on this channel. And if you enjoy this content, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. So we're previewing all 32 NFL teams here on Forward Progress as we make our way towards training camp and through the preseason. If you're interested in these kinds of videos, make sure you turn on notifications when you subscribe. And if you don't like notifications, there should be a button on your screen somewhere. Click that. It'll take you to a playlist. Bookmark that playlist. You'll never miss one of these videos in the future. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll catch you guys here in the next one.